Hello, and thank you for joining us for part 2 of our conversation with Dr. Ann Parr. As a recap, Dr. Parr is a spinal cord injury research scientist at the University of Minnesota. Joining me as co-host is Rich Sluice, a board member for MCPF. At the tail end of last episode, we were hearing about the breakthrough research going on in Dr. Parr's lab called epidermal stimulation. Today, however, she's going to focus a little bit more on the research going on around the world. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Based on the research your team is doing and the projects you're working on currently, I guess what percentage would you say are focused on this kind of immediate solution, or how many of them are more focused on that long term? You know, we're hoping that this makes a change 20 years down the road versus tomorrow. So how do you guys break that down where you're working today?
Yeah, so I would say that my research is really in two very different areas. And one is the epidural stimulation. We're launching a new clinical trial shortly for cervical patients on epidural stimulation. And so we're just kind of getting all the paperwork and everything together for that study. And then the things that go on in my lab are more basic science. And even those are sort of divided into a couple of different areas. One area that's more translational is we're doing some 3D printing work where we're 3D printing scaffolds and we're 3D printing the cells right into the scaffolds. And we've discovered that by doing it this way, they actually form these things called organoids, which is basically mini spinal cords on a dish. So we found that they sort of auto assemble when you print them in this 3D scaffold, which is really exciting for us. So there are some scaffolds that are in clinical trial now from other groups, not with cells in them, but without cells. So that's sort of moving forward.
Is that sort of like
area.
A bridge, like a really small bridge?
Yes.
Of sorts?
Yeah, exactly.
Is that
so the
for
idea,
complete severed spinal cords, or
no,
okay.
It's actually for contused spinal cords. And so that gets into like a whole other issue of cutting into the spinal cord to insert the device. But I think it's possible. That's one of the studies right now that's ongoing. They've been cutting into the spinal cord. So it is, like I say, it's possible. And
is there anything, I guess, currently in your research outside of what we've already talked about that you're particularly jazzed about, or like is showing an incredible amount of promise that you can't wait for time to hurry up and give you more answers? Or where are you at? Kind of like, is there any one particular point in research that you're particularly excited about?
Well, I think the epidural stimulation stuff is jazzing me up a lot right now.
Yeah.
So we're excited, like I say, to move forward with our studies. And there are a couple of other groups. And it's like I say, there's not a lot of people out there doing this right now. But I think more people are looking at starting these studies, which I think is really important. There's a group in Europe that Gregoire Courtine is a name to keep your eye on. He's doing some really good research. Susan Harkema in Louisville has been doing this research for quite a while. And they both came out of the same lab of Reggie Edgerton in California, who was sort of the father of this idea of using epidural stimulation for spinal cord injury. So all of these have kind of branched out. And so I keep my eye on all of these groups and sort of what they're doing. And it's really exciting.
Based on our first session, we kind of talked about, a couple of different places around the globe that are focused on spinal cord injury research and, the advancements that have been taking place. I believe in Japan is one of the places we focused on. You mentioned Europe. Are there other places globally, whether it's the U.S., Canada, other countries that are really showing promise in the SCI community and promise in the research being done?
As I mentioned earlier, I think the research going on in Japan right now is really cutting edge. And why is that research going on in Japan? Well, one of the reasons is because, as I had mentioned earlier, the iPS cell technology the government has allowed certain exceptions for that research to move forward. And actually, iPS cell technology was invented in Japan. So that kind of makes logical sense. And also, I mentioned in Europe, there's some really exciting research going on in spinal cord injury. There's some, as I mentioned, Gregoire Courtine's research in epidural stimulation. There's some very exciting research going on in London as well. It has more to do with acute spinal cord injury and whether decompression of the actual rather than just taking the bone off, of doing a more complete decompression by widening the dura, for example, the dura being the lining that surrounds the spinal cord. There's some exciting research going on in that area. And then also there are a lot of collaborations between Canada and the US, of which there's some exciting things going on, again, in the area of epidural stimulation. Also, in more simple things like lumbar drainage for acute spinal cord injury. There's some exciting research going on in Vancouver, in that area. And then around the United States, of course, there's a number of centers. And there's a lot of research going on that I don't know about. I know that New Zealand and Australia have a significant investment in spinal cord injury research. But I'm not as familiar with all the different things that are going on over there.
Cool.
If you had to pick maybe the most promising, the top 2 or 3 things, what do you think you would put at the top of the list right now?
Well, the top of the list right now is epidural stimulation. And I think I'd put that first just because it's here now and it's available, and it's really taken off. As I had mentioned earlier as well, though epidural stimulation isn't a cure. It doesn't restore sensory function. It can restore and does restore some volitional movement in most patients. I think it will be of benefit to most patients. It does more than just volitional movement as well. There's some evidence that it can restore dysautonomia or problems with blood pressure that occur after spinal cord injury, and bowel and bladder function. So I definitely put that number 1. And again, because it's here now and we can put these stimulators into patients. I also think that the stem cell research, again, it's not as far along as that, but there is this clinical trials that's starting in Japan. They've the last I heard, they had enrolled 1 patient because they just opened it up. They were sort of closed down because of COVID. And so we'll just have to wait and see, because it's going to take a few years to enroll all the patients and to see how they do. So that's number 2. I'd say for number 3, maybe the scaffold research that's going on, and whether putting in a scaffold to support cell growth is going to be useful. And then there are a few other areas I would say that are important but apply more to acute spinal cord injury, because, that's sort of a different kettle of fish than chronic spinal cord injury. And so some of the things in acute spinal cord injury are things like lumbar drainage, duroplasty, and whether timing of surgical intervention, like how fast can we get these patients decompressed if they have a compressed spinal cord. Some of that research is really, really important. But again, when you talk about acute and chronic, they're really 2 very different things.
So what are you seeing for the future? What do you see? How does the future going to be different given the research that's been going on today? Like, are you confident there is a cure that will be found for the majority of spinal cord injuries? Or what do you see the future being?
Yeah. So, there's one other thing I should mention too that I neglected to mention, is that there is a new drug out there that's close to clinical trial that basically is in spinal cord injury. The idea is that it's going to take down some of the neural networks that surround, like the glial scar that forms around the site of injury, and allow new neurons to grow, new axons to grow
oral
across.
Medication that you take by mouth. Wow.
Yeah. So there's something that's out there. I know it's coming to clinical trials soon. They've developed the drug. It just needs to be tested. So that's something I should mention.
Yeah. It sounds almost high risk for the user though, because if you're breaking down those key elements that are protecting or controlling that, if you are taking those away, they seem like they're at risk. Is that part of the worry about that.
Great point. And so the first trial is with any new drug is called a phase 1 trial, which is for safety. So basically they do dose escalation. So they'll give patients like a little bit of the drug and see if it has negative effects. And then they can give more of the drug, and then they can test it to see if it actually works. But the first study is always a safety study. So the safety study has not been done yet, but it's up and coming. So it's sort of on the verge, something else that's sort of cutting edge at this time period.
Very cool.
But I think you actually asked me a different question.
Yeah, I was asking more about the future of what you see coming down the road for those in the SCI community and those doing research into spinal cord injuries. What does the future look like to you? And do you believe that a solution or a cure is out there?
So I don't think there's one cure. I think, as I mentioned earlier, there's, acute spinal cord injury and chronic spinal cord injury, and those are two very different things. And so treatments for acute may not be the same, probably aren't the same as for chronic. Also, there's cervical injuries versus thoracic injuries. There are all kinds of different nuances to spinal cord injury, and no two patients are ever exactly the same. So I think it's going to be more of a toolbox, a toolkit of treatments rather than a cure. And some of those treatments may work in concert with each other, and some may be freestanding. I think that's where the future is headed. I think there are definitely areas of focus, I think, that are going to come out. One of the things I've talked about quite a bit is epidural stimulation. The biggest thing we don't know about epidural stimulation is actually how to optimize the stimulators. I'd mentioned a little bit previously what epidural stimulation actually is, and it's a procedure that's been around for chronic pain for decades, and now it's being applied to spinal cord injury. And we've seen some really great results with it. But one of the things is, because it was developed for chronic pain, the actual devices are not optimized for spinal cord injury. And so we don't really know even what would be optimal. So we need to design new devices, and we need to partner with some of the companies out there that make these stimulators. We partner with one company now in our trials, not because we're designing new devices, but rather these devices are very expensive, which is another problem. But the company, we work with Abbott, and they actually donate the stimulators for us for free.
Wow.
Because otherwise we wouldn't be able to afford them. So that's been a really good partnership. I know there are other people that are partnered with Medtronic to use, and they use their stimulators. And there is some work by different groups going on to develop these new stimulators, but that's definitely going to be something that's needed and is an up and coming area of research.
That kind of leads into our next question here, which is really, how can Rich or how can we help? How can we get involved with, spinal cord injury research? I mean, can we donate or can we volunteer? Are there ways that we can get involved to help move along research? Or what have you seen as the best places that we can get ourselves involved in this if we're so inclined?
Well, there are ways of donating, certainly through organizations like MCPF and other foundations that direct money towards research and grant mechanisms. There, you can also give money directly to a laboratory doesn't come, for example, to me, it would come through University of Minnesota Foundation.
Okay.
So donating money through that is a possibility. As far as volunteerism goes, there are opportunities. Most of them are through foundations. I do have volunteers in my lab. They usually are undergraduate students, though, who have some involvement with the university already.
Okay. And if for some reason some undergraduate student is watching this, they could potentially reach out and try and, find their way into your program in some way, shape, or form?
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
What about corporations or organizations that focus in this area that you work with that, you mentioned a couple that we could donate to, but are there others that are key resources for you to help keep moving your work along?
Yeah, so, I've benefited from MCPF and their grant mechanism. I've also benefited from the Spinal Cord Society. And I think I mentioned previously that I've had a really good relationship with the spinal cord injured community in Minneapolis. And how that came about was that we had a mutual interest in approaching the Minnesota legislature to move forward a bill that would provide some grant money for traumatic brain injury and spinal cord injury research. And we were successful in obtaining that. I've benefited from that. And it really has made a difference. It's state money that funds some of the startup. And so, for example, this state money had funded eSTAND, which is our epidural stimulation trial run out of Hennepin County. And otherwise that study would have never started. And, to date, we've implanted, I think, around 18 patients. All have benefited. Everyone isn't up walking again, but everybody has benefited at least a little bit in many different areas: quality of life, bowel and bladder, dysautonomia, which, as I mentioned, is, problems with blood pressure regulation after spinal cord injury. And all of the patients have recovered some volitional movement. With some, it's just wiggling their toes, but that makes a difference because it makes patients... Yeah, definitely. And it can reduce spasticity, allow people to make easier transfers. So everybody has benefited from it, and those are patients, those are 18 people that wouldn't have had the opportunity otherwise.
Right.
So, and again, Abbott Labs too has provided these stimulators for us free of charge. And they've made a commitment to provide more moving forward. So we're very grateful to them as well.
So how if I'm just asking a very random question, but how if I was injured and I was interested in getting involved in one of these trials, or, trying to get help and find, if I could move my toes, that would be a world of difference to me. How do I get involved, or how would I even start to look for ways that I could get involved?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you wanted to get involved as a research subject, if you wanted to get implanted. So right now, there are, compared to the number of people out there that have spinal cord injury, unfortunately, there are not a lot of clinical trials out there available. And so we have our website for eSTAND. If you Google it, you can find the website and you can register on the website. So basically, you just put in your name, contact information, all of your basic information. And many of the patients say, well, I'm not eligible for this because right now eSTAND just enrolls people with thoracic injuries. And, within a certain age, blah, 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 all these inclusion and exclusion criteria. But I tell people, go ahead and do it anyways, because we keep this registry. We have you now on our list. And in the future, when we're doing a trial, maybe that is enrolling cervical patients or patients that you might fit into that category, then we can find you on that list and contact you.
Oh, awesome.
That's a great point, because this research continually evolves. And I'm sure if you took a look 12 years ago at what you'd be doing and what you were doing and compared it to what you're doing today, it would be nothing like you would have imagined at the time. But that's the advantage of this research science.
Well, awesome. I think we're about out of time for today's episode, but I really appreciate again that you stopped by and visited with us here. Everyone watching on YouTube or Vimeo, make sure you check out the links in the description. As always, you can donate to the Morton Cure Paralysis Fund via our website. And if there's anything you guys would like to see on future episodes or people you'd like us to interview, please feel free to leave a comment below or shoot us an email. We'd love to hear from you, and thanks for listening, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.